So let's see how you did. Just like the question of, hey, where do babies come from? The question of, why do we have kings, is a really complex question that the vast majority of people living in 1500 BC certainly couldn't wrap their heads around. So people in positions of authority, kings, and the priests who would have passed these songs on from generation to generation come up with a really simple answer. It's not quite the stork, but it's something that we certainly can't prove to be true because of all the religious elements in it. So let's see if you got something very similar to what is in the story. In the beginning, everything was great. It was awesome. It was a veritable Garden of Eden. Everybody was happy. Everybody looked out for each other. Everybody lived a great life. Everybody sacrificed regularly to the gods. And if you remember this from the lecture, what they sacrificed was actually kind of part of the gods because the whole universe was connected to the chief universal god. So when you were sacrificing cattle or sheep, things that the Vedic people who were nomadic herders would have valued, when you're sacrificing those types of things, you're giving it back to the god who provides then, according to priests, things like rain and fertility. So what happens? Well, at some point, people stopped looking out for each other. They got greedy. They looked out for number one. And in doing so, they stopped doing the things that benefited each other and stopped doing the things that benefited the gods. So they started taking care of themselves and they stopped sacrificing to the gods, according to the story. That makes the gods really sad. And it makes things go to crap on Earth because if they aren't sacrificing, then the gods aren't sending the rain. They're all unhappy. So they get together and they go to the chief god and they say, look, life used to be awesome. Now it sucks. How can we get things back on track? And basically the chief god, coming up with thousands of books from his own mind, as is described, steps back and comes to the conclusion that people can never avoid desire. They can't ever get away with greed. This is kind of a universal truth that's being put out there. So if human nature is to always look out for yourself, how can you prevent people from doing that? Well, what this chief god comes up with is the notion that there needs to be somebody to keep people on the right track. So he says, I'm going to talk to the god of creatures, Vishnu. I'm going to tell Vishnu, go find the best person out there, make them the Raja, make them the king, give them the way to guide people to live well, and that will bring harmony and order back into the world. Okay, so that's the basic story. That's the justification for kingship. Now let's interrogate it. Let's tear it apart a little bit. Let's do what I love to do most as a historian. Let's be critical of this. One, we can't ever prove that any of this happened, right? So maybe this is a story that's made up. And if it's a story that's made up, it's made up by a particular person or group of people with a particular purpose. So who do you think might benefit from this story? To me, it's people who are already in positions of power. If you were to tell somebody who doesn't like you as a king that they need to have a king, an easy way to do that is say, look, when there aren't kings, society goes to hell, gods get upset. By the way, remember that you are involved in this religious system where you believe that when you die, if you've lived a good life, you might actually come back and improve. So don't rock the boat. What you might do is come up with a story that justifies your position of power. And let's think about it. Is life always going to be hunky-dory for these folks? Absolutely not. But if you can say as king, look, you guys aren't behaving well, I'm trying to keep you on the right path, and all the things that you're screwing up are what makes life bad right now, that can add an additional incentive to get people to behave well. So this question of where do kings come from, the story is very simple, but there's a lot in it, right? You get people to buy into the religious system, which means they've got to listen to the priests. And if you create kind of a relationship with the priests where you look out for priests and priests look out for rajas or kings, that can be very mutually reinforcing. So hopefully that gets you to at least one angle of how some of these folks might try to create order and stability, and how thinking about who created this and who authored it might help you understand why they portrayed it the way they did. Another really important element to keep in mind here is, remember, none of this was written down. This was passed on from Brahmin to Brahmin. People who were very intelligent and able to interpret these things, which means that nobody can challenge it, right? Nobody can say, let me check that book out of the library and see if what you're saying is correct. Instead, it has to be swallowed. And one of the instances when this kind of starts to unravel is when the Vedic language is written down and people can see it for themselves.